You know, when we talk about the narcissist reaching a breaking point, we have to begin with the illusion of power. Because in the beginning, it doesn't look like collapse. It looks like victory. It looks like strength. It looks like someone standing tall, walking away from a relationship, convinced they have won. And that's important to understand. For the narcissistic individual, control feels like safety. Dominance feels like protection. If they can decide when to withdraw, when to withhold affection, when to criticize, when to leave, then they never have to feel the terrifying vulnerability of being dependent on someone else's love. So when conflict happens, when intimacy deepens, when real emotional exposure begins, their nervous system reads that not as connection, but as danger. And so they pull back. They may criticize the very qualities they once adored. They may accuse their partner of being too emotional, too sensitive, or too demanding. But what is really happening underneath is much more fragile. Real love is beginning to dissolve the protective armor, and that armor was built long ago. No one becomes narcissistic because life was too easy. These defenses are adaptations. At some point, perhaps in childhood, vulnerability was unsafe. Perhaps their emotional needs were dismissed, shamed, or ignored. Perhaps love was conditional. The child learns quickly, I will not depend, I will not need, I will not expose myself. I will survive by being superior, self-contained, untouchable. And when that child grows into an adult and meets someone capable of real intimacy, something extraordinary and frightening occurs. The partner's warmth begins to soften the old rigidity. Their consistency challenges the old narrative that love always disappears. Their empathy exposes the buried grief, and that feels destabilizing. So the narcissist does what once worked. They regain control. They create distance. They assert power. They leave first, or they emotionally detach first, so they never have to experience being left. On the surface, it looks confident. It looks decisive. They may even appear calm, composed, unaffected. But that calm is often dissociation. That composure is often emotional suppression. Power becomes a performance. Now here is the illusion. They believe that by leaving real love, they have protected themselves. They believe that by choosing independence over vulnerability, they have maintained strength. But control is not connection. And eventually, the body knows the difference. Because once the noise settles, once the arguments stop, once the partner stops chasing, once the emotional supply disappears, there is silence, and silence removes distraction. There is no longer someone reflecting admiration back to them, no longer someone reassuring them of their importance, no longer someone absorbing their projections. In that quiet, something uncomfortable begins to surface. At first it may show up as irritation, or boredom, or a sudden need for new stimulation. They may seek validation elsewhere. They may quickly replace the partner. Attention becomes anesthesia, but validation is not intimacy. Admiration is not love. And the nervous system, though defended, still longs for something deeper. You see, authentic love regulates us. When someone truly sees us and accepts us, our physiology settles, our defenses soften. There is a sense of being held, not physically, but emotionally. When that disappears, the body feels the loss even if the mind refuses to acknowledge it. And this is where the illusion begins to crack. Because real love offered something they did not fully understand while they had it. Safety without control, care without manipulation, presence without performance. And when they encounter relationships built only on surface-level validation, they may feel a subtle but persistent emptiness. The ego will fight this awareness. It will say, they were not good enough. They were too demanding. There is someone better. Blame protects the fragile self-image. But beneath blame, there is often grief. Not always conscious grief. Sometimes it appears as restlessness. Sometimes as chronic dissatisfaction. Sometimes as a quiet question they cannot quite silence. Why does nothing feel the same? Because what they walked away from was not weakness. It was depth. And depth requires surrender. To truly receive love, one must risk being known. To be known means exposing shame, fear, inadequacy. It means allowing another person to witness the parts of us we have worked so hard to hide. For someone whose identity was constructed around invulnerability, that exposure feels like annihilation, so they choose power instead. But power without connection is isolating. And isolation, over time, becomes its own kind of suffering. This is not about punishment. It is not about cosmic justice. It is about human psychology. We are wired for attachment. We are wired for connection. Even the most offended individual carries that wiring. You cannot override millions of years of evolution with ego alone. Eventually, the discrepancy becomes undeniable. The admiration of many does not soothe like the understanding of one. Control does not nourish like mutual trust. Superiority does not comfort like acceptance. And this is the beginning of the breaking point. Not dramatic, not explosive, but quiet. A subtle recognition that what was discarded was rare. That the person they dismissed as too much was actually offering depth. That the arguments they framed as proof of incompatibility were often invitations to grow. When that realization begins to dawn, it can feel destabilizing, because now they must confront a painful truth. In protecting themselves from vulnerability, they also protected themselves from love. And here is the tragedy and the possibility. The tragedy is that by the time this awareness fully arrives, the other person may be gone. The possibility is that awareness, if embraced rather than defended against, can become the doorway to healing. But that requires something far more courageous than control. It requires humility. It requires the willingness to say, I was afraid. I did not know how to receive what was offered. I confused power with safety. And for someone whose identity has been built around being untouchable, that is the hardest step of all. So the illusion of power eventually collapses, not because someone defeats them, not because they are exposed publicly, but because the human heart cannot be nourished by dominance alone. Control can win arguments. It cannot create intimacy. And when they finally feel the emptiness behind their victory, that is when the breaking point truly begins. Because the greatest loss is not losing the relationship. It is realizing you chose power over love. And once that illusion of power begins to crack, we are brought to something even more uncomfortable. The realization that real love didn't just feel good. It exposed something. When someone truly loves you, they don't just admire your strengths. They see your pain. They sense your defenses. They notice the moments your smile tightens, the moments your voice hardens, the moments you withdraw. And if they are emotionally attuned, they respond not with attack, but with curiosity and care. Now, for a person carrying unresolved trauma, that kind of attunement can feel deeply threatening, because authentic love is a mirror, and mirrors don't just reflect our beauty, they reflect our wounds. You see, many narcissistic patterns are not born from arrogance. They are born from shame, deep unprocessed shame, a sense, often formed in early childhood, that something is wrong with me. Perhaps their emotions were dismissed. Perhaps they were valued only for achievement. Perhaps affection was inconsistent. The child learns to construct a self that will not be rejected again. I will be exceptional. I will be superior. I will never need anyone. That constructed self becomes armor. It protects against humiliation, abandonment, and the unbearable vulnerability of depending on someone else. Then one day, someone comes along who doesn't want the performance. They want the person underneath. They say things like, you don't have to pretend with me. I'm here. I care about what you feel. And instead of relief, something inside tightens. Because to accept that invitation means dismantling the armor. It means acknowledging needs. It means revisiting old pain that was carefully buried. The nervous system, shaped by early experiences, interprets that as danger. This is why you often see a shift when intimacy deepens. In the beginning, everything feels exhilarating. The admiration flows easily. The connection feels intense. But as the relationship matures, as emotional closeness grows, the partner begins to see inconsistencies. They may gently point out hurtful behaviors. They may ask for more emotional presence. They may express their own needs. To a securely attached person, this is normal relational growth. But to someone whose identity depends on being beyond reproach, Even gentle feedback can feel like exposure, and exposure awakens shame. Now here is the critical point. Shame is one of the most intolerable emotions for the human psyche. It threatens our sense of belonging. It whispers, "You are flawed. You are unlovable." For someone already carrying that unconscious belief, the slightest hint of criticism can trigger a disproportionate reaction. So what happens? Instead of feeling the shame and tracing it back to its origins, they project it outward. They criticize the partner. They accuse them of being too sensitive, too demanding, too dramatic. They devalue the very person who is offering emotional safety. Not because the love wasn't real, but because it was. Real love begins to dissolve defenses. It invites growth. And growth requires facing pain. Many narcissistic individuals would rather destroy the mirror than look into it. And this is the heartbreaking irony. The partner who triggers their discomfort is often the safest person they have ever encountered. The one who says, "I see your fear, and I'm not leaving." The one who responds to anger with steadiness. The one who senses the child beneath the armor. But if you have spent your entire life surviving by denying that vulnerable child exists, having someone see it can feel annihilating. So they push away. They withdraw emotionally. They become cold. They escalate conflicts over minor issues. They rewrite the narrative of the relationship. "We're not compatible. I need someone less emotional. You're trying to control me." Underneath those justifications is something much simpler and much more painful. I cannot tolerate feeling exposed. Authentic intimacy dismantles the illusion of invulnerability, and without that illusion, the old wounds begin to throb. Now, when the relationship ends, whether abruptly or gradually, there may be a temporary sense of relief. The mirror is gone. The discomfort subsides. The shame quiets. They feel back in control, but something else is gone. The opportunity. Because that relationship was not merely about romance. It was an invitation to heal. It was a chance to experience secure attachment. It was a corrective emotional experience. Someone staying present instead of abandoning. Someone responding with empathy instead of rejection. And when they walk away from that, they are not just leaving a person. They are leaving growth. Over time, this realization can begin to surface, especially when subsequent relationships feel shallower. When admiration returns but depth does not. When there is excitement but no safety. When there is validation but no true emotional resonance. They may begin to remember moments, quiet conversations, shared vulnerability, the way their partner responded to their fears without ridicule. They may recognize that what once felt suffocating was actually intimacy. And here is where the breaking point deepens. Because now the awareness is not just, "I lost someone." It is, "I pushed away the one person who saw me clearly and stayed." That is a different kind of pain. It requires acknowledging that the discomfort they felt was not caused by the partner's inadequacy, but by their own unhealed wounds. It requires recognizing that love was not attacking them. It was inviting them, and invitations can be refused. The tragedy is that trauma convinces us that safety is dangerous, and danger is familiar. Chaos feels normal. Distance feels secure, but closeness, real, steady closeness, feels foreign. So when it arrives, instead of resting into it, they fight it. And only later, sometimes much later, do they see that what felt like threat was actually grace. This is not about condemnation. It is about understanding. When we understand that narcissistic defenses are trauma adaptations, we can hold compassion without excusing harm. We can see the frightened child without denying. The adult's responsibility. Because at some point, each of us must choose. Will we continue protecting our wounds, or will we allow them to be healed? Real love will always expose what is unresolved. That exposure is uncomfortable. It shakes the ego. It destabilizes identity. But it also offers transformation. If we reject the mirror, we remain fragmented. If we dare to look, we begin to integrate. And the breaking point comes when they finally understand that the love they destroyed was not their enemy. It was their chance. Because the greatest tragedy is not being wounded. It is refusing the love that could have healed you. And after they have pushed away the person who exposed their wounds, after they have convinced themselves that the problem was intimacy, or compatibility, or timing, something very predictable often happens. They replace them, sometimes quickly, sometimes almost immediately. From the outside, it can look like proof that they never cared. See? They've already moved on. But what we are often witnessing is not emotional closure. It is emotional avoidance. Because new attention is intoxicating. In the beginning of any relationship, there is admiration, curiosity, idealization. The new partner sees what is polished, charming, confident. The narcissistic individual feels energized by this reflection. It soothes the ego. It restores the sense of power that may have been shaken in the previous relationship. And for a while, this feels like relief. There are no deep conversations about childhood wounds, no one challenging their defensiveness, no one asking for accountability. There is chemistry, excitement, validation. And validation can feel very similar to love, but it is not the same thing. Validation says, you are impressive. Love says, you are safe to be human. Those are two very different experiences. When someone loses a partner who offered emotional depth, what they lose is not just admiration. They lose attunement. They lose the subtle regulating presence of someone who could sense their moods, who understood their silences, who stayed steady during their storms. That kind of connection takes time to build. It requires vulnerability. It requires mutual investment. And once it's gone, it cannot be instantly recreated with someone new. But the nervous system still craves stimulation, so they seek it. A new relationship provides distraction from grief they may not even consciously acknowledge. It allows them to bypass reflection. Instead of sitting with the discomfort of what was lost, they fill the space with novelty. And novelty is powerful. It releases dopamine. It creates anticipation. It makes everything feel alive again. But dopamine is not attachment. Excitement is not intimacy. Over time, and this is the part people don't see, the new relationship begins to move past the honeymoon stage. The admiration becomes familiar. The novelty settles. The new partner begins to have needs, opinions, vulnerabilities of their own. And once again, depth knocks at the door. If the underlying wounds remain unaddressed, the same patterns emerge. Emotional withdrawal, devaluation, irritation with closeness, a subtle sense of suffocation when intimacy deepens. Because the issue was never the previous partner. It was the fear of being known. And here is where comparison begins. Often unconsciously, they may start to notice something missing. Not necessarily dramatic, just subtle. Perhaps the new partner laughs at their jokes, but doesn't truly understand their fears. Perhaps there is passion, but not emotional resonance. Perhaps there is admiration, but not grounding. The person they lost offered something quieter, something steadier. Something that didn't just stimulate the ego B. UT settled the nervous system, and the body remembers that. You see, our physiology encodes relational safety. When we are with someone who feels secure, our breathing changes, our muscles relax, our heart rate stabilizes. We feel less vigilant. When that kind of safety is replaced by surface-level excitement, there can be an underlying restlessness, a subtle agitation, a feeling that something essential is absent, but admitting that would require acknowledging the value of what was lost. And so the mind often resists. Instead, they may double down, this relationship is better, this person is easier, I'm happier now. Sometimes they even believe it. Yet happiness built on avoidance is fragile, because depth cannot be faked. At some point, perhaps in a quiet moment, late at night, or during conflict, or in an unexpected memory, the comparison becomes undeniable. They remember how the previous partner listened, how they noticed small details, how they stayed during difficult conversations instead of escalating them. They may recall a moment of vulnerability, something they shared reluctantly, and how it was met, not with ridicule, but with compassion. and that memory lingers. The replacement never quite replicates that experience, because what they replaced was not just a person. It was history, shared growth, emotional investment, the slow weaving together of two nervous systems learning to trust. That cannot be downloaded into someone new, and this is often the quiet beginning of regret. Not dramatic, not necessarily visible to others, but internal. A subtle awareness that admiration is abundant, but understanding is rare. They may begin to feel a peculiar loneliness even while partnered, a sense that something essential is missing. Not excitement, not attraction, but depth. Depth requires risk, and without risk, connection remains shallow. Now here is the paradox. The very qualities that made the previous partner challenging, their emotional awareness, their desire for honest conversation, their unwillingness to accept surface-level engagement, are the same qualities that made the relationship meaningful. But meaning can feel threatening to someone who equates vulnerability with danger. So they chose easier, and easier often means emptier. Over time, this emptiness can manifest as irritability, boredom, or a constant search for new stimulation. The cycle may repeat: idealization, excitement, devaluation, detachment. Each time, the initial high grows shorter. Each time, the dissatisfaction arrives sooner, because unresolved wounds follow us, and no new person can compensate for an old injury we refuse to face. Eventually, the realization begins to form. It wasn't that the previous love was lacking. It was that it demanded growth. And growth was uncomfortable. When that awareness settles in, it can feel sobering. The recognition that what they dismissed as too intense was actually intimacy. That what they labeled neediness was emotional engagement. That what they escaped from was not dysfunction, but depth. And depth is rare. By the time this understanding crystallizes, the other person may have healed. They may have rebuilt. They may have learned to value themselves enough not to return. And then the loss becomes real. Not because the replacement failed, but because comparison exposed the truth. Validation can be found almost anywhere. Genuine emotional connection cannot. And when someone finally sees that they traded depth for distraction, intimacy for ego-soothing, growth for comfort, that is when the breaking point sharpens, because it is no longer about pride. It is about recognizing that what they lost was irreplaceable. You can replace a partner. You cannot replace real love. And then something happens that often surprises them: the silence. Up until this point, the relationship, even in its dysfunction, was filled with noise. Arguments, emotional reactions, attempts to reconnect, explanations, defenses. Even the tension itself was a form of engagement. There was energy. There was proof that they still mattered in someone's emotional world. But when the other person finally detaches, not in anger, not in protest, but in clarity, the dynamic changes completely. No more long messages, no more pleading conversations, no more emotional pursuit. Just space. And space can be deafening. You see, for someone who relies on external validation or emotional reaction to regulate their inner world, silence feels like withdrawal. It feels like something essential has been cut off, because even conflict provided supply. Even being criticized meant they were still central in the other person's attention. But indifference, that is different. When the empathic partner, or simply the emotionally healthy partner, reaches the point of genuine detachment, it is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is often calm, grounded, final. And that calm can feel profoundly unsettling, because now there is nothing to push against. No emotion to dominate, no reaction to control, no narrative to manipulate. The mirror is gone. The audience is gone. And what remains is the self. For many narcissistic individuals, distraction has always been the strategy. If something feels uncomfortable internally, they move outward, into work, into new relationships, into stimulation, into argument. But when someone truly stops engaging, that familiar outlet disappears. Silence removes distraction. At first, they may try to break it. A message, a subtle attempt to provoke jealousy, a reminder of their presence. not always because they want reconciliation, but because the I want reassurance that they still matter. And if the response is neutral or absent, something begins to shift internally. There is a particular kind of discomfort that arises when you realize you no longer have emotional access to someone who once cared deeply for you. It's not just missing them, it's recognizing that the influence you once held is gone. Control has limits, and silence exposes those limits. Without the former partner reacting, chasing, or engaging, there is no external confirmation of importance. And when external confirmation fades, the internal void becomes more noticeable. This is where self-confrontation begins, whether consciously or unconsciously. They may start remembering things differently. Conversations they dismissed, moments of vulnerability they brushed aside, the patience the other person showed, the consistency, the attempts to repair. Memory shifts when distance grows. In the noise of the relationship, it was easy to focus on perceived flaws. But in silence, nuance returns. They may recall not just the arguments, but the tenderness. Not just the tension, but the safety. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Silence gives the nervous system time to register loss. When someone who provided emotional grounding is no longer present, the body feels it. The evenings are quieter. The small daily check-ins are gone. The subtle reassurance of someone knowing your patterns disappears. At first, pride may mask the impact. I'm fine. I don't need anyone. But pride cannot regulate loneliness. Over time, the absence becomes heavier. Because unlike conflict, silence offers no distraction from self-awareness. There is no one to blame in an empty room. No one to argue with. No one to project onto. Just the echo of your own thoughts. And for someone who has spent years avoiding vulnerability, that echo can be deeply uncomfortable. They may begin to ask questions they previously avoided. Why did they really leave? Why didn't they fight harder to stay? Why does their absence feel different from others? Silence invites reflection, and reflection threatens the ego. Because if the other person has truly moved on, not in anger, but in peace, then the narrative that they were too needy or too dramatic begins to weaken. If they are no longer chasing, no longer reacting, no longer orbiting, it suggests something powerful. They found strength. And that realization can sting, not because the narcissistic individual wants harm for them, but because it challenges the illusion of indispensability. It reveals that the person they once dismissed can survive, and even thrive, without them. Silence becomes evidence. Evidence that love was not dependency. Evidence that care was not weakness. Evidence that the bond they undervalued was not fragile, but chosen. And once someone chooses to walk away calmly, it is much harder to rewrite history. This is often where the emotional weight truly settles in. Because now it is not about winning or losing. It is about irreversibility. When someone stops engaging, they are communicating something without words. I have accepted reality. And acceptance closes doors that manipulation cannot reopen. In that quiet space, the narcissistic individual may feel a mixture of emotions: confusion, regret, anger, longing. Not always neatly defined. Sometimes just a restlessness that cannot be soothed by new attention. Because attention does not erase silence. And silence, when prolonged, becomes clarity. It clarifies what is gone. It clarifies what was taken for granted. It clarifies that real love does not beg indefinitely. It offers, it tries, it communicates. And when it is repeatedly dismissed, it withdraws with dignity. And dignity is something you cannot control. The breaking point intensifies here, not because of confrontation, but because of its absence. There is no dramatic ending to fight against, just the steady awareness that the person who once invested emotionally has chosen themselves. And that choice is final. When there is no more noise, no more emotional chaos, no more reactive energy, the illusion of superiority has nothing to feed on. Only truth remains, and the truth is this: silence is not emptiness. It is consequence. It is the space where denial fades and reality settles. It is the moment when they understand that the absence of love feels heavier than the discomfort of intimacy ever did. And in that stillness, without distraction, without control, without applause, They are left alone with the realization that what they lost is not coming back, because sometimes the loudest message is the one spoken in silence. And when the noise stops, the truth finally speaks. And when that silence has done its work, when the distraction has faded and the absence has become undeniable, another battle begins. Not with the former partner, not with the outside world, but internally. The ego begins to fight the truth, because recognizing that you destroyed something real is not a small realization. It threatens identity. It shakes the carefully constructed self-image. If I admit that I pushed away someone who genuinely loved me, then I must also admit that I was afraid, that I was reactive, that I caused harm. And for someone whose psychological survival has depended on maintaining a sense of superiority or control, that admission feels intolerable. So the mind does what it has always done. It defends. It rewrites the story. They weren't that great. They were too sensitive. It wouldn't have worked anyway. I did what I had to do. This is not always conscious manipulation. Often it is SS, elf protection. The psyche bends reality just enough to avoid collapse, because shame, real, unfiltered shame, feels annihilating. When a person has built their identity around being strong, independent, untouchable, the idea that they sabotaged love can feel like weakness. And weakness, in their early life experience, may have been dangerous. So instead of accountability, there is rationalization. Instead of grief, there is blame. Instead of reflection, there is projection. Projection is powerful. If I can convince myself that you were the problem, then I do not have to examine my own fear. If I can focus on your flaws, I do not have to confront my own defenses. It keeps the ego intact. But here is the thing about truth. It does not disappear just because it is denied. It waits, and it shows up in quiet moments, in subtle comparisons, in that slight tightening in the chest when their name comes up, in the awareness that no one else has quite matched what was lost. The ego may argue loudly, but the nervous system remembers accurately. It remembers who felt safe. It remembers who tried. It remembers who stayed longer than most would have. And this creates internal tension. On one side, the defensive narrative, I was right. On the other, the emerging awareness, maybe I wasn't. This tension is deeply uncomfortable, because if they allow the second voice to grow louder, they must confront something painful, their own role. Accountability is not just saying, I made mistakes. It is feeling the weight of those mistakes. It is allowing remorse to surface without immediately numbing it with distraction or justification. And remorse, when authentic, requires vulnerability. It requires saying internally, I hurt someone who loved me. For someone accustomed to externalizing blame, this can feel destabilizing. There may be flashes of clarity followed by swift mental corrections. Yes, but they also. Yes, but I was under stress. Yes, but they triggered me. And while those factors may contain partial truths, they can also function as shields. The ego's job is protection. It protects identity. It protects coherence. But sometimes what it protects most fiercely is the very pattern causing suffering. When the narcissistic individual edges closer to recognizing the truth, that they sabotaged real love out of fear, there can be a sense of vertigo. Because if that is true, then the problem was never fully outside of them. And that realization is humbling. Humility is not humiliation. But for someone whose early experiences equated vulnerability with humiliation, the two can feel identical. So the mind resists. They may seek reassurance from others who validate their version of events. They may amplify the flaws of the former partner in conversations. They may lean into pride, all in an effort to silence the growing awareness that something precious was mishandled. But the more they defend against truth, the more restless they often become. Because deep down, the psyche longs for integration. It longs for congruence between what is real and what is acknowledged. When there is a gap between those two, tension builds. And here is where the real breaking point begins to form. It is not dramatic. It is not explosive. It is subtle and internal. A growing inability to fully believe the old narrative. A quiet recognition that the former partner's love was genuine. that their requests were not attacks but bids for connection, that the conflict was not persecution, but invitation, invitation to grow, invitation to soften, invitation to face old wounds. And perhaps they refused. Sitting with that possibility requires courage. It requires stepping out of the role of victim or hero and into the role of human, flawed, defensive, capable of harm. This is where real transformation could begin. Because once someone can say, without excuses, I was afraid of intimacy, the defensive structure begins to loosen. Once they can acknowledge, I pushed them away because being known scared me, healing becomes possible. But many never fully cross that threshold. They hover at the edge of insight, then retreat back into pride. And yet, even partial awareness changes something. They may never publicly admit their role. They may never reach out with an apology. But internally, a seed has been planted, the seed of recognition. Recognition that they destroyed something real not because it was flawed, but because they were unprepared to receive it. That realization carries grief. Not just grief for the lost partner, but grief for themselves, for the younger version who learned that vulnerability was unsafe, for the child who had to build armor instead of trust, for the adult who mistook love for threat. When that grief surfaces, it can feel heavy, but it is also honest, and honesty is the beginning of freedom. Because as long as the ego is fighting the truth, there is no peace, there is only defense, only justification. Only a constant internal argument. But when the fight softens, when they allow even a moment of unguarded reflection, something shifts. The energy once used to protect the false self becomes available for growth. This is the crossroads. They can double down on ego and repeat the cycle, or they can lean into humility and begin the slow work of healing. The breaking point is not when they feel abandoned. It is when they can no longer outrun the truth. And the truth is simple, though painful. They were loved, they were seen, and they chose fear over intimacy. The ego may resist it, but the heart already knows. Because the most difficult confession is not spoken to another person. It is whispered to yourself in the quiet. I pushed away the love I was not ready to receive. And when that whisper becomes harder to silence, when the ego grows tired of fighting and the truth lingers in the background, something else emerges. Regret. But not the kind of regret that leads immediately to transformation. Not the kind that easily turns into repair. This is a more complicated experience. Because regret requires emotional capacity. And if someone has spent a lifetime disconnecting from their own vulnerability, they may not yet have the tools to fully process what they feel. So regret shows up sideways. It may show up as restlessness, a sudden urge to reach out, a late-night message framed casually, just checking in. It may appear as nostalgia, replaying old memories with unexpected softness. It may even surface as irritation with current relationships, as though nothing quite measures up. On the surface, it can look like longing, but underneath, it is often something deeper. The recognition that they felt more alive when they were loved authentically. And here is the subtle but crucial distinction. Sometimes it is not the partner they miss most. It is who they were in the presence of that partner. When someone loves you with patience and depth, it brings parts of you forward, softer parts, more open parts, perhaps even hopeful parts. For a person defended against vulnerability, that experience can be both terrifying and transformative. When it's gone, the contrast becomes stark. They may look around at their current life, the achievements, the admirers, the distractions, and feel a peculiar emptiness. Not dramatic despair, just a quiet dissatisfaction. Because admiration does not nourish the nervous system the way attuned connection does. Validation stimulates, but love regulates. And once someone has tasted regulation, even briefly, its absence is felt. Yet here is where the difficulty lies. Feeling regret is one thing. Knowing what to do with it is another. If emotional development was interrupted early in life, if feelings were never safely processed, then sitting with regret can feel overwhelming. There may be no internal roadmap for remorse, no language for vulnerability. no experience of healthy repair. So instead of fully feeling the sadness, the psyche may convert it into something more manageable. Irritation, blame, a sudden desire to prove something, or the impulse to reconnect, not from grounded accountability, but from discomfort. Sometimes they reach out hoping to relieve their own unease rather than truly repair what was broken. They want reassurance that they are not the villain, that they are still valued, that the door is not completely closed. But genuine repair requires something very specific, the willingness to tolerate shame without collapsing into it. And that is advanced emotional work. To say, I hurt you, I see how I did it, I understand the impact, I am not asking you to fix my guilt, requires maturity that many defended individuals have not yet cultivated. So regret lingers in a half-formed state. They may fantasize about reconciliation. They may imagine conversations where they finally explain themselves perfectly. They may romanticize the past. But when faced with the actual vulnerability required to apologize sincerely, fear reactivates. Because accountability threatens the old identity. If I admit I caused harm, who am I? For someone whose self-concept depends on being right, strong, superior, that question feels destabilizing. And yet the longer regret remains unprocessed, the more it mutates. It can become cynicism. It can become emotional numbness. It can become a quiet bitterness toward relationships themselves. This is just how love goes. Nothing lasts. People are too demanding. I did not know how to receive what was offered. Underneath many narcissistic patterns is a profound deficiency in emotional capacity. Not intelligence, not competence, but emotional literacy. The ability to sit with discomfort without fleeing. The ability to feel guilt without converting it into self-hatred or blame. The ability to tolerate closeness without perceiving it as threat. When regret arises but these capacities are absent, the individual feels trapped. They know something valuable was lost, but they do not know how to metabolize that knowledge, and so it churns internally. Sometimes it surfaces years later, at unexpected times, a memory triggered by a song, a quiet evening that feels heavier than usual, watching someone else experience the kind of steady love they once had. Regret without growth can become haunting. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a steady undercurrent of what if. And here is the tragedy and the invitation. Regret, when fully felt, can be transformative. It can humble us. It can soften defenses. It can motivate deep healing, but only if we allow it to move through us instead of around us. If they were able to sit with the sadness, not escape it, not justify it, not convert it, they might discover something profound beneath it. Grief. Grief not just for the lost partner, but for the self that never learned secure attachment, for the childhood that required armor, for the opportunities missed out of fear. Grief, when embraced, reorganizes us, but grief requires surrender, and surrender is the opposite of control. So the breaking point sharpens here, not because they miss the person in a superficial way, but because they begin to understand that the loss reflects something about them. It reflects unhealed wounds. It reflects emotional avoidance. It reflects a lack of capacity that could have been developed. And this realization can either harden or humble. If it hardens, the cycle repeats. If it humbles, healing begins. The difference lies in one simple but terrifying step: taking responsibility without self-condemnation. To say, I did not know how to love safely, but I can learn. That sentence contains both accountability and hope. Without it, regret becomes a restless ghost, always present, never resolved. With it, regret becomes a teacher. And so the question is not whether they feel something when they lose real love. Most do. The question is whether they have the courage to grow from it. Because missing how someone made you feel is not the same as learning how to love. And until they develop the emotional capacity they once lacked, regret will remain just that: regret, not redemption. And the most painful realization of all is this: it was never love that failed. It was the inability to hold it. And then we arrive at the moment that is quieter than people expect. The true BR, eking point, is not dramatic. It is not a public collapse. It is not a sudden confession posted for the world to see. It is deeply internal. It happens when all the defenses have been tried, when blame has lost its intensity, when replacement relationships have failed to recreate what was lost, when silence has done its work, when regret has circled long enough that it can no longer be dismissed. It is the moment they realize, fully realize, that what they had was real, not perfect, not fantasy, but real, and they destroyed it. That realization lands differently than anger or loneliness. It carries weight, because now the story changes. It is no longer, we weren't compatible. It is no longer, they were too much. It becomes something much harder to say, they loved me in a way I did not know how to receive. And when that sentence settles in the body, it humbles you. You begin to see the memories differently. The arguments you framed as attacks were often bids for closeness. The tears you dismissed as manipulation were often expressions of pain. The requests for reassurance were invitations to connect more deeply. You see the pattern, and you see your role in it. This is the breaking point, because it strips away the last illusion. The illusion that you were merely reacting. Now you see that you were defending. You were protecting old wounds at the cost of present love. And once you see that clearly, you cannot unsee it. There may be a deep exhale, or perhaps a heaviness in the chest, a kind of emotional gravity that says, I understand now. Understanding can hurt, because with understanding comes responsibility. You can no longer claim ignorance. You can no longer fully believe the narrative that preserved your ego. You begin to recognize how rare it was to be loved with patience. How uncommon it is for someone to stay through your defensiveness, to try to understand your triggers, to extend empathy when you offer distance. You remember the consistency, the loyalty, the depth of emotional investment, and you see how you chipped away at it, not always intentionally, not maliciously, but defensively, reactively, unconsciously. And here is where the grief becomes layered. There is grief for the relationship, but there is also grief for yourself, for the part of you that did not feel worthy of that love, for the part of you that interpreted safety as suffocation, for the child inside who learned that closeness equals danger, because now you see that the threat was never the partner, the threat was vulnerability, and vulnerability was precisely what could have healed you. This is the painful irony. The very thing you avoided was the medicine. When someone truly loves you, they offer co-regulation, they offer steadiness, they offer a corrective experience to old attachment wounds. But if your nervous system is wired to interpret steadiness as unfamiliar, you may sabotage it in favor of chaos, because chaos feels known. At the breaking point, that pattern becomes undeniable. You see how you mistook intensity for intimacy, how you equated control with strength, how you prioritized being right over being connected, and you begin to feel the cost. Not just the cost of losing them, but the cost of staying defended for so long. You may realize that the love you were given required growth, and you were not ready to grow. It required humility, and you were protecting pride. It required emotional honesty, and you were skilled at avoidance. This realization does not make you evil. It makes you human, but it does confront you with a choice. Because once awareness arrives, you stand at a crossroads. You can numb it. You can bury it under new distractions. You can convince yourself it does not matter, or you can allow it to change you. The breaking point is powerful because it contains potential energy. It is the moment when the old identity cracks enough for something more authentic to emerge. If you allow yourself to fully feel the loss, without self-hatred, without justification, you may discover something unexpected beneath the regret. Compassion. Compassion for the younger self, who built defenses to survive. Compassion for the fear that drove your reactions. Compassion for the fact that you were doing the best you could with the awareness you had at the time. And from that compassion, accountability becomes possible. Not the dramatic kind, not grand gestures meant to erase guilt, but the quiet, sustained commitment to growth, to therapy, to self-reflection, to learning how to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing it, to practicing vulnerability in small, tolerable doses. You may never repair the relationship you lost, Sometimes the other person has moved on, healed, closed the door. But the breaking point is not only about getting them back. It is about not repeating the pattern. It is about ensuring that if love comes again, and it often does, in some form, you are more capable of holding it. Because the deepest pain in all of this is not simply that you lost someone who loved you. It is realizing that you were loved, truly loved, and you did not know how to stay. When that truth lands, it can break you open. And being broken open is not the same as being broken. It can be the beginning of integration. You start to understand that strength is not dominance, that intimacy is not weakness, that being known does not equal being exposed to harm. You begin to see that real love is rare not because it does not exist, but because it requires courage to sustain. And perhaps, in that quiet understanding, you finally whisper the words, "Yo, you once resisted. I was afraid. I see it now, and I want to be different." That is the real breaking point, not when you lose them, but when you lose the illusion that love was the problem. Because the hardest truth of all is this: you were not destroyed by love. You were undone by your fear of it.